Growing up under the shadow of a real estate tycoon means learning early that love is just another contract. My father controlled every luxury resort along the Atlantic coastline, treating his children like pieces on a corporate chessboard. The afternoon I married a man with grease-stained hands, my father stood up at our reception and cut me off in front of everyone. He promised I would inherit nothing, expecting me to beg for his approval. My husband just smiled, leaned into the microphone, and delivered a four-word response that silenced the entire ballroom. Nobody in that room actually knew what my husband did for a living, or what I had been quietly engineering behind their backs. My family assumed they had broken me by taking away my trust fund and my last name. 6 months later, they would discover the truth at the grand opening of my father's billion-dollar crown jewel. It happened in front of 500 high society guests at the exact moment his entire empire depended on the man he had publicly humiliated. That dinner began like every other forced family gathering at a massive mahogany table overlooking the private harbor. My father loved to boast about owning the ocean, though he really only owned the view and the people trapped in his orbit. Without looking up from his meal, my father announced that he had scheduled a date for me with a wealthy hedge fund heir. He explained that the upcoming corporate merger was stalling and having us seen together would secure the deal. I set my fork down, trying to keep my hands from shaking as resentment burned in my chest. Reaching into my purse, my fingers brushed against the worn brass calipers my grandfather had given me before he passed away. I looked my father dead in the eye and told him I was already seeing someone else seriously. The silence that followed was heavy and cold, causing my mother's fake smile to instantly freeze on her face. My father set his glass down, staring at me with the absolute detachment he usually reserved for a bad property investment. He told me that in our circle, marriage was a strategic merger, and that sentimentality was a luxury for people who could not afford power. I kept my mouth shut, refusing to give him my boyfriend's name or explain how little he fit into this toxic world. I only smiled and let the silence sit there, knowing that some answers are better delivered later. My father had me investigated immediately, which was his standard procedure for anyone who dared to defy his wishes. A few days later, I was summoned to his penthouse office, where the massive glass windows were designed to make visitors feel completely insignificant. A thin manila folder sat on his desk, containing everything his private detectives could dig up on my life. He opened it and read the name Julian Vance aloud, his voice dripping with disgust as he noted his lack of assets. He closed the file and asked if I was truly throwing away a fortune for a basic aviation mechanic. I told him Julian was a decent, honest man who actually cared about people rather than profit margins. My father laughed, walking over to the window with his hands behind his back as he delivered his final ultimatum. He told me that our family did not associate with laborers, and that good men were simply hired by people who actually built legacies. Here is the rewritten version starting from exactly the point you provided, and expanded in fresh wording while preserving the overall meaning. It is written in US English, with no headings or introduction. I earned my engineering degree entirely through my own effort. While my sister enjoyed every privilege money could buy, I spent countless nights working long shifts just to cover tuition, textbooks, and rent. Every exam I passed represented another sacrifice, another sleepless week, and another paycheck that disappeared before I even held it. My parents never questioned the cost of my sister's education or lifestyle because they gladly paid for everything she wanted. Meanwhile, I was expected to prove my worth by surviving without their support. Looking back now, I realize they weren't teaching me independence. They were simply showing me where I stood in their list of priorities. When they finally canceled every credit card connected to my name, the message couldn't have been clearer. They believed financial pressure would force me to crawl back and accept the future they had chosen for me. Instead, Julian and I packed everything we owned into a borrowed truck and moved into a modest little house near a regional airfield. It wasn't elegant or spacious, but it was ours. The sound of airplanes taking off became part of our daily lives, shaking the windows every few hours. Oddly enough, that constant roar reminded me that freedom always comes with a little noise. Life there was simple. We repaired old furniture instead of buying new pieces. We cooked every meal ourselves and carefully stretched every dollar we earned. Those were some of the happiest months of my life because every improvement we made belonged to us alone. No one could claim credit for it, and no one could threaten to take it away. One thing about Julian always caught my attention. Almost every evening, he stepped outside onto the porch to answer business calls that often lasted well past midnight. His voice changed during those conversations. He sounded confident, precise, and incredibly respected. Occasionally, I heard him discussing contracts, expansion plans, or international schedules, but he never volunteered details unless I asked. I noticed all of it, yet I never pushed him for answers. From the day we met, we'd made a promise to each other. Neither of us would demand explanations before the other was ready to share them. We believed that trust should never depend on constant questioning. If there was something important to know, the truth would reveal itself when the time was right. What I couldn't possibly have known was that Julian had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase nearly every public record connected to his identity. His name rarely appeared on official corporate filings. Interviews didn't exist. Photos were almost impossible to find. It wasn't because he was hiding from responsibility. It was because protecting his privacy protected something much larger than himself. Neither of us imagined how dramatically that hidden truth would change everything. Our wedding day finally arrived, and I expected a quiet celebration surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us. Instead, as we pulled into the venue, I immediately realized someone had transformed the event into something completely different. Luxury vehicles filled the entire parking area from one end to the other. Chauffeurs stood beside polished sedans worth more than most homes. Exotic sports cars reflected the morning sunlight, while professionally dressed attendants hurried guests toward the entrance. It looked less like a wedding and more like an exclusive gathering of billionaires. I didn't have to guess who was responsible. My father had completely taken control. Without asking for our approval, he had invited nearly 200 of the wealthiest people in his professional circle. Investors, executives, developers, politicians, and influential clients wandered through the entrance, carrying expensive gifts and congratulating one another as though they had arrived for a corporate gala instead of their daughter's wedding. Near the front doors stood a massive seating chart mounted on a polished wooden easel. Every guest's name had been carefully typed beneath elegant table numbers. Curious, I stepped closer to find where Julian and I were supposed to sit. My own seat appeared near the front of the ballroom. Julian's didn't. I searched again, slowly moving my finger across every table assignment until I finally located his placement all the way at the back of the room. His chair sat beneath a bright green emergency exit sign in the farthest corner of the ballroom. Then, I noticed something even worse. The printed card above the chair didn't even include his name. Instead, it simply described him as an uninvited guest. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The cruelty had been carefully planned. Someone had intentionally approved that wording, printed it, and positioned it where everyone could see it. It wasn't an accident. It was a public statement meant to humiliate the man I loved. Julian quietly walked beside me and read the card himself. He didn't argue. He didn't lose his temper. He simply looked at it for a moment, removed the card from its holder, folded it neatly, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and smiled gently at me. "It's only paper," he whispered. His calm response somehow hurt more than the insult itself. The ceremony continued despite everything. Guests chatted over expensive meals while pretending nothing unusual had happened. My father laughed with business partners as though he were hosting the event of the season. Eventually, he stood to deliver a toast. At first, his speech sounded almost respectable. He thanked everyone for attending and spoke about family traditions, success, and protecting a legacy. Then, his tone changed. He looked directly toward our table. With hundreds of guests watching, he announced that I had chosen love over responsibility and embarrassed generations of our family. He claimed I had damaged our reputation by marrying someone he described as nothing more than a grease stain on the family's name. Then came the sentence I knew he had rehearsed. He officially declared that I was no longer part of his family. Silence spread across the ballroom. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward us. Julian slowly rose from his chair. He looked straight at my father without anger, fear, or hesitation. His voice remained perfectly calm. "We don't need it." Those 4 words echoed through the room more powerfully than any speech my father had delivered all evening. We left the reception together without looking back once. As painful as the experience had been, we believed that chapter of our lives was finally over. Months passed. My father devoted all of his energy to completing the most ambitious resort project his company had ever attempted. The development featured luxury villas, overwater suites, private marinas, and a state-of-the-art aviation terminal intended to attract the world's wealthiest travelers. Everything depended on one partnership. For nearly 2 years, he had aggressively pursued a contract with Titan Aviation Group, believing that private aircraft service would transform the resort into an international destination. The only problem was that no one ever seemed to meet Titan's chairman. He avoided publicity completely. His appearances were almost non-existent. Industry magazines referred to him as one of the most influential yet invisible executives in modern aviation. When the resort's grand opening finally arrived, more than 500 wealthy guests filled the enormous glass pavilion overlooking the water. Investors, celebrities, government officials, and international business leaders gathered together, all waiting for the mysterious chairman to make his first major public appearance. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone before announcing that the chairman of Titan Aviation group had officially arrived. The massive display screens illuminated, the music faded, the entire pavilion became absolutely silent. Beside me, Julian gently released my hand. He looked into my eyes for just a brief moment, offering the same reassuring smile he had given me on our wedding day. Then he calmly walked toward the stage. At first, no one understood. Then recognition spread through the audience like a wave. People began standing one after another. Applause thundered throughout the pavilion as 500 guests rose to welcome the man whose identity had remained hidden for years. I turned toward my father. Every bit of confidence disappeared from his face. His complexion turned pale. The champagne glass slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered across the polished floor while he remained frozen in disbelief. The hard-working man he had dismissed as insignificant. The man he had deliberately humiliated. The man he had seated beneath an emergency exit sign was now being celebrated as the powerful executive whose decision would determine the future of his billion-dollar investment.